The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as hundreds of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a decorated United States Marine on his first visit to London. His crisp dress blues stood out among the sea of casual clothes and cameras, earning respectful nods from fellow veterans who recognized his service ribbons. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from facing real danger. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and steel-gray eyes, he commanded attention without seeking it. His visit to London was supposed to be peaceful, a well-deserved vacation after his recent promotion and reassignment to embassy duty. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of military precision. The Queen's Guard, resplendent in their scarlet tunics and towering bearskin hats, marched with clockwork accuracy across the palace forecourt. Leading them was Guardsman James Wellington, a 10-year veteran of the Coldstream Guards who took immense pride in his role protecting the royal family. Wellington had earned his position through years of discipline and unwavering dedication. Born in Yorkshire to a family of modest means, he had joined the military at 18 and worked his way up through sheer determination. His record was spotless, his bearing impeccable, and his loyalty to the crown absolute. As the ceremony progressed, Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the precision and pageantry. He had always respected military tradition, regardless of the country, and watching these soldiers perform their duties with such dedication reminded him of why he had chosen to serve his own nation. The crowd pressed closer to the palace gates, phones and cameras capturing every moment. Children sat on parents' shoulders, tourists whispered in multiple languages, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. This was exactly the kind of peaceful, civilized moment Marcus had been looking forward to after years of combat zones and military bases. But peaceful moments have a way of changing without warning. As the guard began their final maneuvers, a commotion erupted near the palace gates. A young woman, clearly distressed and speaking rapidly in accented English, had somehow slipped past the outer barriers. She was calling out desperately, waving a manila envelope above her head, trying to reach someone, anyone, who might listen to her plea. Security immediately moved to intercede, but the woman's desperation was evident. She was well-dressed, not a typical protester, and seemed to be carrying official-looking documents. The crowd began to murmur, unsure whether this was part of the ceremony or a genuine emergency. Marcus watched the scene unfold with the trained eye of someone accustomed to assessing threats. His instincts, honed by years of military service, told him this wasn't a security threat, but rather someone genuinely in need of help. The woman's body language, her desperate but controlled demeanor, and the way she clutched those documents suggested urgency rather than malice. Wellington, maintaining his position in formation, had also noticed the disturbance. Protocol demanded that he remain focused on his ceremonial duties, but his peripheral vision caught sight of the unfolding situation. The woman was now surrounded by security personnel, and her voice carried across the courtyard with increasing desperation. "Please, someone must help," she called out in what sounded like an Eastern European accent. "My brother is innocent. These papers prove it. Please, someone with authority must see them." The security team was professional but firm, beginning to escort her away from the ceremonial area. Standard procedure required removing any disruption as quickly and quietly as possible. But something about the woman's plea struck a chord with both men. Though they stood on opposite sides of the crowd, Marcus had seen enough injustice in war zones to recognize when someone was fighting for something bigger than themselves. Wellington, despite his rigid training, had grown up seeing his own family struggle against bureaucratic indifference. Both men found themselves drawn to help, though their positions and circumstances created an impossible situation. As the woman was led away, still calling out her plea, something unexpected happened. Her envelope tore in the struggle, and official-looking papers scattered across the courtyard, carried by the morning breeze toward both the crowd and the ceremonial formation. One document landed directly at Wellington's feet. Another was caught by Marcus's quick reflexes as it flew toward the tourist section. Both men found themselves holding what appeared to be legal documents, court papers, and official correspondence in a foreign language. The crowd held its breath. The ceremony. Wellington stared down at the document by his feet, his mind racing beneath the stoic exterior required by his position. Years of training had taught him to remain motionless during ceremonies, to be a living statue representing the crown's unwavering strength. But the words visible on the torn paper seemed to burn into his consciousness. Emergency appeal and wrongful conviction, in bold letters at the top of what appeared to be a legal document. Across the courtyard, Marcus held similar papers, his trained eyes quickly scanning the English portions mixed with what looked like Czech or Polish text. Court dates, case numbers, and references to human rights violations painted a picture of someone fighting desperately through legal channels for justice. The woman who had scattered these documents was no longer visible, having been efficiently removed by security. But her desperate voice still echoed in the sudden silence. The ceremony had effectively ground to a halt, though protocol demanded it continue. The other guards maintained their positions with mechanical precision, but the hundreds of spectators were focused entirely on the unfolding drama. Cameras that had been recording a routine tourist attraction were now capturing something far more significant. Marcus made the first move. Setting aside the ingrained caution that comes from being a foreigner in another country's capital, he stepped forward from the crowd. His dress blue uniform immediately identified him as American military, and his deliberate movement toward the ceremonial area sent ripples of surprise through the gathered tourists. "Excuse me," he called out in a clear, respectful voice that carried across the courtyard. "I believe these documents belong to that woman. They appear to be urgent legal matters." His words were addressed to no one in particular, but everyone understood he was really speaking to the guards, to the officials, to anyone with authority who might listen. By speaking aloud, he had transformed a silent dilemma into a public moment that demanded response. Wellington felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. The document at his feet seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. His commanding officer stood rigid nearby, and protocols he had followed for a decade demanded he ignore everything except his ceremonial duties. But something deeper than protocol was stirring within him, the same sense of duty that had originally drawn him to serve. The crowd waited in absolute silence. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Though they couldn't understand exactly what, tourists found themselves inadvertent witnesses to a moral crisis playing out in real time. Then Wellington did something that shocked everyone, including himself. Maintaining perfect military bearing, he took a single, measured step backward. The universal military signal for requesting permission to break from position. It was subtle, but to anyone with military training, including Marcus, the meaning was unmistakable. His commanding officer, Captain Harrison, was faced with an impossible situation. Strict protocol demanded he ignore the gesture and order the ceremony to continue. But the public setting, the media presence, and the obvious moral complexity of the situation made any response potentially explosive. "Sir," Wellington spoke for the first time during the ceremony, his voice carrying the crisp authority of the Queen's English. "I believe there may be urgent matters requiring official attention." It was masterfully phrased, not a direct challenge to authority, but a formal observation that created space for action. Captain Harrison's military mind immediately grasped both the tactical brilliance and the enormous risk of the moment. Marcus recognized the courage it had taken for Wellington to speak. Breaking ceremonial protocol in such a public setting could end a career, regardless of the motivation. But the guardsman had found a way to address the situation without directly violating his orders. "Those documents," Marcus continued, his voice steady and respectful, "appear to concern someone's legal rights. As visiting military personnel, I would be honored to ensure they reach appropriate authorities, but I believe this falls under British jurisdiction." He was offering Wellington and the British military a way to take action without losing face. By acknowledging British authority while offering assistance, Marcus had created a diplomatic solution that preserved everyone's honor while addressing the moral imperative before them. The crowd began to understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just about scattered papers or a disrupted ceremony. It was about two professional soldiers from different nations finding a way to do what was right despite institutional constraints. Captain Harrison made a decision that would later be studied in military academies as an example of leadership under pressure. "Guardsman Wellington," he announced formally, "please secure those documents for proper review by appropriate authorities. The ceremony will resume momentarily." Wellington snapped to attention, executed a perfect about-face, and retrieved the papers with military precision. As he straightened, he caught Marcus's eye across the courtyard. Neither man smiled, but there was a moment of mutual recognition. Two soldiers acknowledging each other across the divide of nationality and circumstance. But the real showdown was just beginning. As Wellington gathered the scattered papers, more documents became visible, blown by the wind into various corners of the courtyard. The woman's desperate attempt to share her evidence had created a complex situation that couldn't be resolved by simply collecting a few sheets of paper. Marcus realized that the papers he held might contain crucial information that needed to be considered alongside what Wellington was collecting. But approaching the guard formation would be highly irregular, potentially inflammatory, and could be misinterpreted as an American soldier interfering with British military operations. Wellington faced a similar dilemma from the opposite direction. His duty to secure the documents was clear, but ensuring they reached the right people would require cooperation beyond the immediate military chain of command. The American Marine clearly possessed additional materials that might be essential to understanding the full situation. The crowd sensed the tension building between the two men. What had begun as a simple gesture of human decency was evolving into something more complex. A careful dance between duty and conscience, protocol and justice, national pride and universal humanity. The silence stretched between them as both men calculated their next moves, knowing that their choices in the next few moments would determine whether a desperate woman's plea for justice would disappear into bureaucratic indifference or receive the attention it deserved. Every eye in the courtyard was focused on these two soldiers, waiting to see how their silent confrontation would resolve. The courtyard had become an arena of unspoken tension. Marcus stood at the edge of the tourist area, military documents clutched in his hand, while Wellington remained in formation, but clearly wrestling with his next move. Both men understood that their actions in the following moments would either resolve the situation or escalate it beyond anyone's control. Marcus made a calculated decision. Rather than approaching the guard formation directly, which could be seen as provocative, he began reading aloud from the documents in his possession. His voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard. "Emergency appeal dated 3 days ago," he announced, his military bearing giving weight to every word. "Viktor Petrov, sentenced to 15 years for terrorism charges in Prague. New evidence suggests planted evidence and coerced testimony." The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't what anyone had expected to witness during a routine ceremonial event. But Marcus continued, understanding that publicity might be the woman's only hope for justice. "The appeal states that Mr. Petrov was investigating government corruption when he was arrested. Key witness testimony has been recanted, and forensic evidence has been challenged by independent experts." Wellington's jaw tightened as he listened. The formal language and specific details suggested these weren't the ravings of a desperate relative, but genuine legal documents that had somehow made their way to one of the world's most secure locations. Someone had been desperate enough to risk arrest just to get these papers in front of people who might have the power to help. Captain Harrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sergeant Thompson, you are disrupting a formal ceremony on Crown property. I must ask you to cease this inappropriate behavior immediately." But Marcus had spent enough years in combat zones to recognize when backing down meant letting injustice prevail. "Sir, with respect, these documents appear to detail a time-sensitive legal matter that may involve someone's life. I'm simply ensuring the information reaches appropriate authorities." The confrontation was no longer subtle. An American Marine was publicly challenging British military authority on British soil, while hundreds of witnesses recorded every moment. The diplomatic implications were staggering, but both men seemed willing to accept those consequences. Wellington found himself at the center of an impossible choice. Supporting Marcus would mean openly defying his commanding officer in front of crowds and cameras, but allowing the documents to disappear into bureaucracy might mean condemning an innocent person to years of imprisonment. The guardsman made a decision that stunned everyone present. Still maintaining perfect military posture, He spoke directly to Marcus across the courtyard. "Sergeant Thompson." His voice carried the crisp authority of years of ceremonial practice. "I believe the documents in my possession contain additional information relevant to what you've just read." It was a formal acknowledgement that transcended their nationality, ranks, and the complicated diplomatic situation. Wellington was offering to share information with a foreign soldier in public. Despite direct orders from his commanding officer, the crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. This was unprecedented. A member of the Queen's Guard, breaking protocol to cooperate with an American serviceman over what appeared to be a matter of international justice. Captain Harrison's face had gone from red to purple. "Guardsman Wellington, you will return to your position immediately and cease this unauthorized communication." But Wellington had passed the point of no return. Years of following orders had brought him to this moment, where orders themselves seemed to conflict with the deeper duty he had sworn to uphold. "Sir, these documents appear to detail a miscarriage of justice. My oath is to serve Crown and country, which includes upholding the values of justice that the Crown represents." It was a masterful response, essentially arguing that defying orders was actually the most loyal thing he could do. The legal and philosophical complexity of his position left Captain Harrison momentarily speechless. Marcus recognized the courage Wellington was showing and decided to match it. "Guardsman Wellington, if you're willing to share that information, I'll ensure it reaches the appropriate American diplomatic channels for review. Between our two nations, we should be able to ensure this receives proper attention." The crowd was now completely silent, understanding they were witnessing something historic. Two professional soldiers from allied nations were putting their careers on the line for a principle that transcended national boundaries. But Captain Harrison had reached his limit. "Guardsman Wellington, you are relieved of duty. Step away from the formation immediately." Wellington's response shocked everyone, including Marcus. Instead of stepping away, he executed a perfect military about-face and began marching directly toward Marcus with ceremonial precision. His bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned, his rifle held at exactly the correct angle, his pace measured and deliberate. The crowd gasped. A Queen's Guard was abandoning his post and marching toward an American soldier with obvious intent to engage. Palace security moved closer, uncertain whether this was some kind of threat or unprecedented cooperation. Marcus stood his ground as Wellington approached, recognizing the tremendous personal risk the guardsman was taking. When Wellington stopped exactly 6 feet away and executed another perfect about-face to stand at attention facing the palace, Marcus understood the gesture immediately. Wellington was positioning himself between Marcus and the British military authority, making a symbolic statement that transcended words. He was literally standing with the American Marine against the institutional pressure to ignore potential injustice. The moment stretched endlessly as both men stood in perfect military bearing, facing the palace together while holding documents that might save an innocent man's life. Neither spoke, but their body language communicated volumes to the hundreds of witnesses watching in stunned silence. Captain Harrison approached with several other officers, their faces grim. Palace security flanked them, creating a surreal tableau of military authority facing off against two individual soldiers who had chosen conscience over convenience. "This is your final opportunity to return to your positions and end this disruption," Captain Harrison announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear. Marcus and Wellington remained motionless, their silent solidarity more powerful than any words could have been. They had created a moment that would be remembered long after the ceremony was forgotten. Two soldiers from different nations, standing together for justice. Despite overwhelming pressure to conform, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve. The shocked silence was broken only by the distant sound of London traffic and the clicking of countless cameras capturing a moment that would soon spread around the world. The standoff lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. A lifetime in military terms, an eternity for the crowd holding its breath, and forever in the minds of those who witnessed it. Marcus and Wellington stood shoulder to shoulder in perfect military bearing, their silence more powerful than any speech about duty, honor, or justice. Then something unexpected happened that changed everything. A voice from the crowd called out in heavily accented English. "That is my sister. That is Ania Petrov." An elderly man pushed through the tourists, pointing at the scattered documents. "She come to London because Prague courts will not listen. Our Victor is innocent." The man's appearance transformed the entire dynamic. This was no longer about abstract principles or military protocol. There was a real family, desperately fighting for their loved one's freedom. The elderly man's weathered hands shook as he reached toward the documents that had blown across the courtyard. Marcus made immediate eye contact with Wellington, and both men understood that the situation had evolved beyond their personal confrontation with authority. Someone's father was standing before them, and their decision would directly impact a real family's suffering. Captain Harrison found himself facing a completely new scenario. Disciplining soldiers for a protocol violation was one thing, but preventing a family from accessing legal documents that might prove their relative's innocence was quite another, especially with hundreds of cameras recording every moment. Wellington spoke first, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with crisp authority. "Sir, I formally request permission to ensure these documents reach appropriate legal channels for review, given their apparent relevance to an ongoing legal matter affecting British-Czech relations." It was brilliantly phrased, transforming personal defiance into a formal military recommendation about international diplomatic concerns. Captain Harrison's expression shifted as he realized Wellington had found a way to make cooperation the officially correct response. Marcus stepped forward and handed his documents to the elderly man, but spoke to the assembled officials. "As a representative of the United States military visiting Britain, I believe our two nations share common values regarding due process and justice. I'm confident appropriate British authorities will ensure these materials receive proper review." He was essentially challenging Britain to live up to its own stated values while offering American support for whatever action they chose to take. The diplomatic elegance of his position made it nearly impossible for officials to respond with anything other than cooperation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman in civilian clothes emerged from the group of officials surrounding Captain Harrison. "I'm Inspector Margaret Davies, Metropolitan Police. If these documents relate to an ongoing legal matter, they should be properly examined by appropriate authorities." Inspector Davies had been assigned to security for the ceremony, but her appearance provided everyone with a face-saving solution. Police authority superseded military protocol when it came to potential legal matters, creating a pathway for action that preserved everyone's dignity. She approached the elderly man gently. "Sir, if you believe these documents are relevant to your son's case, I'll ensure they're reviewed by our International Legal Liaison Office. We work closely with Czech authorities on various matters." The relief in the old man's eyes was immediate and heartbreaking. "Please. Yes. Ania. She risked everything to bring these here. Victor is good boy. He never hurt anyone. These papers, they show truth." Wellington remained at attention next to Marcus, as Inspector Davies carefully collected all the scattered documents. Their silent solidarity had created space for this resolution, but both men knew their personal situation remained unresolved. Captain Harrison approached them with an unreadable expression. "Guardsman Wellington, your actions today were highly irregular and potentially damaging to military discipline." Wellington's response was immediate and formal. "Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions and any consequences deemed appropriate." But Captain Harrison wasn't finished. However, given the circumstances and the apparent legitimacy of the legal concerns raised, I believe your actions, while unauthorized, were consistent with the values the Guard is sworn to protect. It was as close to praise as military discipline would allow, and Wellington's barely visible smile showed he understood the significance. Marcus received similar treatment from the American Embassy liaison, who had appeared among the officials. "Sergeant Thompson, your diplomatic handling of a complex situation reflects well on American military professionalism, though future situations should be channeled through proper diplomatic procedures." 3 weeks later, Viktor Petrov was released from prison in Prague after the documents revealed by his sister led to a full investigation that uncovered prosecutorial misconduct and planted evidence. The case became a landmark example of how public pressure and international attention could expose injustice within legal systems. Marcus returned to his embassy duties with a commendation for exceptional diplomatic sensitivity in a complex international situation. His actions had strengthened rather than damaged American-British relations, proving that doing the right thing often serves national interests better than blind adherence to protocol. Wellington received a different kind of recognition. While officially reprimanded for breaking protocol, he was privately commended by senior officers who understood that his actions had ultimately enhanced the reputation of the Queen's Guard. 6 months later, he was promoted to Lance Corporal and assigned to train new recruits in ethical decision-making under pressure. The ceremony that day never officially resumed, but nobody seemed to mind. The tourists left with something far more valuable than photos of routine pageantry. They had witnessed 2 soldiers choosing conscience over convenience, demonstrating that military honor sometimes requires questioning rather than blindly following orders. Inspector Davies became a key figure in establishing improved procedures for handling international legal emergencies that reached British soil through unconventional channels. The Buckingham Palace protocol she developed ensured that desperate pleas for justice would receive appropriate review rather than being dismissed as mere disruptions. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the friendship that developed between Marcus and Wellington. They maintained correspondence after Marcus returned to America, sharing their experiences of navigating the complex relationship between duty and conscience. Both men learned that true military honor sometimes requires the courage to stand alone, even when, especially when, doing so challenges established authority. The elderly Mr. Petrov wrote letters to both men for years afterward, updating them on Victor's recovery and his new life as a free man. In those letters, he never called them heroes or made grand statements about their courage. Instead, he simply thanked them for listening when no one else would, and for proving that sometimes the right thing to do is also the most powerful thing that can be done. The YouTube video of their silent standoff has been viewed millions of times, shared by military personnel worldwide as an example of how real leadership sometimes looks very different from what training manuals describe. In the comments, soldiers from dozens of countries share their own stories of moments when they had to choose between orders and conscience, finding inspiration in 2 men who showed that standing together for justice transcends any uniform they might wear. The ceremony that ended in shocking silence ultimately became a powerful reminder that the truest military virtues are not displayed in perfect formations or flawless execution of orders, but in the courage to act with integrity when everything else tells you to look away. AD effectively stopped. Though the other guards maintained their positions with practiced discipline, all eyes were now focused on what would happen next. Marcus looked at the papers in his hands, then across the courtyard to where Wellington stood motionless in formation, a similar document at his feet. Their eyes met across the distance that separated them. One man bound by ceremonial duty, the other free to act but in foreign territory with no official authority. In that moment, both men faced the same impossible choice: follow protocol and ignore a potential injustice, or step outside their roles to help someone who might desperately need it. The weight of their decision would reshape not only their own lives but also create a moment that hundreds of witnesses would never forget. The silence stretched across the courtyard like a taut wire, ready to snap with whatever choice they made next.